I want to introduce, to get us started, Kathleen Carroll. And Kathleen is the chair of the Committee to Protect Journalists. She is also former executive editor of the Associated Press. Both at AP and CPJ, she's done amazing work on behalf of journalists around the world. Despite the fact that we have competed journalistically, we've always worked together to try to preserve the safety of our journalists in the field. Collaboration, I think, is going to be a big theme of what we talk about today, the importance of everybody working together on this issue, despite the fact that they may work for competing organizations. Kathleen has done an amazing job at CPJ as chair and for many, many years as an active board member. So I want to introduce Kathleen to get this started. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve, and I would just add to what he had to say about collaboration. I'd also like to add my thanks to the Globe and Mail and our friends at the Columbia Journalism Review, as well as our friends at Reuters, which always provides a great setting. Journalists are by nature procrastinators, which is why we told you this thing was going to start at 2 and we started at 2:15. We're sometimes better at responding to crises than heading them off in the first place. But there's no doubt that we are now in a crisis. Journalists around the world are being killed and tortured and jailed and otherwise intimidated more than ever before. Despots who might have thought twice before attacking the press in an earlier era now gleefully follow the lead of the President of the United States, who spews falsehoods like hay fever sneezing fits and calls any coverage that doesn't glorify him fake news. It's a mess that has galvanized people and organizations that believe in a free press like nothing before. But let's be sure we don't squander this moment. We get distracted easily and we get bored easily, and we can't let that happen here. And we can't do this alone. It's vital, as Steve said, that we work together, leveraging our shared impact to beat back everything that threatens the ability of journalists to report freely. It's also essential that we use forums like this one to bring those messages to people outside the profession. We can't just keep preaching to the choir. We need our audiences to be engaged in the risks that we take on their behalf, because it is our audiences and the citizens who are, after all, the real benefit. They really benefit from a free press. So to get us started in the first of 3 panels today, I'd like to introduce our first moderator, Kyle Pope, who's editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review, and I would add my amens to the praise about the edition that you're seeing here. CJR is a valued partner in our shared mission to keep journalists and journalism free. So Kyle?
Thank you. Thanks all of you for coming. We're very happy to be here. We started working at CJR. We knew we wanted to sort of focus in on a deep dive look at threats against journalism. We really started around last fall, around the 1-year anniversary of the U.S. presidential election, and we thought we sort of immediately had a handle on the kind of threats that we were going to be looking at, which is sort of what you would expect: threats of libel suits, threats of lawsuits, threats against reporters physically. And while we found all of that, we were surprised as we kept working at this that the range of what was threatening journalists and journalism was much bigger than we had gambled on. And that became the sort of guiding principle of what we spent the next few months looking at, which was that this threat was very broad. And that's the beginning of what we're going to talk about today. Because it ranges from these traditional threats, like the ones you would imagine, to the threat posed by burnout, both for journalists and for those who consume what we do. It includes sexual harassment. It includes the threat of a business model that isn't quite delivering a business that enables journalists to do their jobs in some cases. We'll talk later about the effects of Facebook and Twitter on journalism. So this is all, it's a much bigger topic than we were sort of anticipating, but it's a lot more interesting. It's both scarier and also in some ways more hopeful. One of the things that we'll talk about today is how some of the threats, especially from Donald Trump, that a lot of us had anticipated after the election have not materialized. So that's an interesting question, why that hasn't happened and what those things are. And then we'll also talk about the fact that what we're experiencing in the U.S. under Trump is just one example of a worldview and an attitude towards the press, an antagonism towards the press that is definitely global and that we're seeing around the world manifest in different ways. So we're thrilled you're here. We're totally, I think this couldn't be a better time to take a look at all of this, and we've got the people here that are really going to help us sort through it. I want to start, though, by beginning with the basics of what the threat is in terms of the more conventional threats, and getting a sense of, especially in the U.S., and then we'll broaden it out beyond that, but to start in the U.S., where we are in terms of threats against the press. I'm going to start with Alexandra Ellerbeck, who's the first of two Alexes on this panel, so I apologize at the beginning. She's the North American Program Coordinator for CPJ, previously worked at Freedom House on its Freedom on the Net publication, and she was a real partner with us in putting together this issue of CJR. Welcome.
Thank you.
So walk us through, well, first let's talk about the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, what that is, what it does, and what its findings are so far.
Yeah, so we launched the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker this summer. It's a project to systematically document a range of press freedom violations in the U.S., and it now has a year's worth of data. We're looking at border stops. Those are instances where journalists are stopped coming into the U.S. and subject to secondary screening, occasionally subject to invasive device searches without probable cause. We're looking at arrests. There were 34 arrests of journalists last year. A lot of that has to do with this uptick in protests and police tactics like kettling, like surrounding groups of protesters, arresting everybody, and not really making any difference between who's a journalist, who's a protester who's exercising First Amendment rights and not breaking any laws, and who might be breaking some laws. We document physical attacks, and we saw 44 physical attacks against journalists, ranging from pretty minor things like a protester grabbing a journalist's camera or phone to more egregious assaults like the infamous case of then candidate, now congressman, from Montana, Greg Gianforte, who body slammed a Guardian reporter.
And just so I understand, it's impossible for us to know trend lines on this, right? Because this is the first year of the data?
Yeah, and we
Do you have a sense, though, of how to contextualize this?
Yeah, I think that was one of the big challenges, because that is the question everybody wants answered. Like, is it worse now under Trump? Are there more arrests? Are there more physical attacks in this current environment, which we know is a very hostile one? But we didn't think that there was a way to go back retrospectively and have the same quality of data. So we don't have the numbers to compare. What I think we can say is that it's a very hostile environment, and while we can't say, this particular arrest or this particular trend in arrests has gone up because of the current political climate, there are clear cases where we see a trickle down in the rhetoric that we have at the national level that affects reporters. We see cases where, the Missouri governor, in my home state of Missouri, the governor calls the media fake news when he denies interviews or blocks people from his Facebook page. I think the case of Greg Gianforte that I mentioned earlier is another case of that trickle down, where the rhetoric at the national level is being mimicked at the local level. And then we also are seeing just a massive uptick, at least in reported cases that we hear about, of online harassment, of death threats, of journalists having their private information put online.
I mentioned at the beginning this piece that you wrote with Joel Simon about the threats that haven't materialized. Going into this presidency, the fear level among journalists was quite high. It was this weird situation where you had fear matched with a great sense of mission and purpose. But what are some of the things that we were worried about a year ago that we just haven't seen yet materialized, with the understanding that we know that calling attention to this could cause us problems? But go ahead.
Yeah, we always worry about giving the sort of to-do list of how you could crack down on the press. You know, there was some that we sort of worried about, but we kind of knew would never happen. So when Trump says he's going to open up libel laws, that's pretty hard because there isn't a federal libel law to open up. So that didn't happen. You know, he threatened to use the regulatory power of the state to go after media companies, which is incredibly concerning. I think the big thing
didn't happen, or at least hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I mean, not that in no sort of clear-cut case that we can point to. I think the big thing that we worried about was subpoenas and leak investigations. And that's actually because of the previous president. Obama was, in some ways, pretty bad for transparency and the press as well. So under the Obama administration, at least 8 journalistic sources, or at least 8 individual government contractors or employees were prosecuted under this 100-year-old World War I era law called the Espionage Act for allegedly giving classified information to journalists. And in the midst of these prosecutions, journalists were subpoenaed, the government tried to get journalists to give up their sources in court. They labeled one journalist a co-conspirator. And so we've been and are very worried that the Trump administration will follow in these footsteps, because now you have this administration that talks constantly about leaks, about cracking down on leaks, and is very hostile to the press. So far, we've only seen one prosecution under the Espionage Act, but I think that is more a factor related to time. It takes a long time to prepare these cases. The first cases under the Obama administration came a year or 2 in, so I don't think we're out of the woods. And the Attorney General has said he wants to make it easier to subpoena reporters, which is not a good sign.
So you don't actually think it's just rhetoric that won't be acted on? You think they want to get to it? You see signs that this is a priority?
I think that, I think it's hard to tell. And there's always this aspect of leak investigations that you don't always know where they'll end up when you start going down that road. So there can be some disincentives for prosecutors to target every leak. There can be political factors behind the scene. But I personally would be somewhat surprised if we don't see more leak prosecutions, if we don't see threats of subpoenaing reporters.
I want to turn now to Paul Tomasz, who's the top news. That's a heck of a title, America's top news editor. It's like a TV show.
Talk to Steve about that. We can get that show.
At Reuters. You previously were the U.S. elections editor.
Yeah.
I thought it would be interesting, just given this climate that Alex talked about, this general threat climate, the rhetoric being what it is. You help direct reporters who cover this administration and cover everything that they do. What's different about, given this climate, covering this, what is different about being a sort of journalist involved in the day-to-day?
Yeah, a couple things first. It's interesting that you talked about the sort of trickle-down effect of the rhetoric, right? I think that's true, and that's a danger, right? That what suddenly becomes acceptable at the national level becomes acceptable at the state level and the local level, right?
And how do you see that play out? You hear that from State House reporters?
Well, yes. I think that you see that in the tone everywhere, right? And you can't miss that tone. But I think the other thing is something Kathleen pointed out, which is that the U.S. is sort of among the beacons of free press around the world, right? And as you see that light dim, it kind of gives free rein to governments and officials around the world to step back even further, right? So So it's interesting how this plays out both here in or there in the U.S. on a local level, and around the world. But to answer your question, during the campaign, it kind of came at us out of the blue. You weren't expecting. There's never been a campaign like that, and it took some adjustment to get reporters used to going to really hostile campaign events, right? To covering a candidate or surrogates for a candidate who simply at times didn't tell the truth, right? In sort of outlandish, outrageous ways. It took a whole sort of different type of thinking to cover that campaign. And I think for the press writ large, that took some time to adjust to. It wasn't something that we were accustomed to. I think the same holds true now covering the administration. The administration isn't that much different than the campaign was. I mean, it really operates fundamentally the same way. And I think it's taken journalists a while to adjust to that, right?
It's almost like there's a need for like the language isn't quite there, or the storytelling tools aren't quite there.
Really, I mean, that's true. They're, in many cases, in many ways, they're not. As a journalist working in the United States, covering Washington, D.C., you're not used to covering administration that challenges other sort of fundamental parts of the government, right? You're not used to administration challenging its own Justice Department or FBI, right? So when that happens, you have no context as a reporter to put that in, particularly if you've just been covering Washington, D.C. politics your entire career. How do you wrap your head around that? How do you communicate the importance of that and the significance of that to your readers, right? How do you, as a reporter, have any context to put that in? It really changes how you approach all of your reporting down there.
And isn't it, I've heard this from other journalists who cover this administration, the dirty secret is that the access to people in the White House is actually quite good compared to past administrations.
Yeah, it is. And that's sort of the paradox, right? But that also creates problems. In a way, great, you have access, right? You have sources throughout the administration, throughout the White House, throughout the government that you can tap. Again, it raises other problems. One, you're getting a lot of different stories. You're getting a lot of dishonesty in that reporting, right? So there's a lot to dig through in talking to all those different sources. The government is divided up into so many sort of little mini factions and power struggles, right? That you get different stories, and it's very difficult to get to the truth on that. The second danger of that is that it becomes that access and the sort of soap opera that is the administration becomes an enormous distraction from what you should be reporting, right? Suddenly, a lot of the conversation, a lot of sources are telling you who's in and who's out and who's up and who's down, right? It becomes reality TV within the White House, and readers read that, right? And reporters chase that, and it is not time well spent. It's time reporting on reality TV rather than reporting on actual issues around whether that's foreign policy or it's healthcare or it's immigration or whatever the pressing issues of the moment are. They get lost in the shuffle of all of this kind of internal soap opera distraction, which sources within the White House are happy to talk about and eager to talk about.
You mentioned not knowing how hard it is to know what your readers are looking for. What is your sense of whether your readers or readers in general, I guess, care about any of the climate that we're talking about right here? Like the sort of hostility to the press, the sort of, this use of fake news to discredit facts in journalism. Do you have any sense of how this is connecting to your readers, whether they care, whether they're responding somehow? This goes to what Kathleen said about it's not our job to preach to everybody here why this isn't a good thing. Part of our job is to communicate why, if you're not a journalist, if you're just a citizen or a reader or a viewer, why you should care at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you look, I have no inside knowledge on what readers across the world think on this, but I think if you look at polling alone, it tells you there is obviously an enormous distrust of the media, right? And And obviously the administration fuels that, right, with the idea of fake news, right? That everything that they don't like is fake news. Everything that doesn't reflect well upon them is fake news. As a reporter, I think that's very, very difficult, right? Whether people really think it or it is the perception that the audience thinks it, working every day, working really hard to try and bring out the truth, and having some sense that people doubt that your reporting is accurate, right? Or that it isn't unbiased and fact-based is extraordinarily disheartening, right? To get up and do that job every day and feel as though, whether it's reality or not, what people really think is very difficult to know, but feel as though your audience distrusts you, right? That they don't believe that what you're doing is really true and honest work. I think that has an effect on the newsroom and an effect on any reporter.
Which is the perfect transition to my colleague Alexandria Neeson, who's a senior staff writer for CJR, previously a reporter at the Village Voice. Alex wrote a terrific piece for this next issue of the magazine about, it was partly about burnout and just what it's like to be a journalist living in this news cycle and reporting in this news cycle. It was also about what it's like to be a reader. But this notion that Paul just talked about, this like, what is it like to do a job where you're being called a liar, called a evil, whatever, day after day after day after day. You're here as a sort of stand-in for what it's like to do this. It's a heavy burden. Talk us through sort of how you think journalists are navigating this.
I mean, I think it's been incredibly demoralizing on a couple of different levels. I think it's important to remember that, you know, when we went into the campaign cycle and sort of a lot of the hostile language towards journalism as an institution and towards reporters, when that sort of began, I think there are segments of the journalism community that had sort of been experiencing things similar to that already. Excuse me. And it sort of very suddenly was ramped up, and now it was kind of everyone was experiencing this. For years before the 2016 election, I think we'd seen some issues with burnout in the news cycle in, for example, Black reporters and Black people in general. You know, watching these videos go viral in the news of unarmed shootings of Black men and boys and women and girls, and experiencing a sort of burnout, a sort of exhaustion, and this very strange intersection of, like, I'm a reporter and this is my job to watch this, to read it, to write about it, for some people. But I'm also a Black person living in America who's impacted by this outside of just my role as a reporter. So I think when we moved into the election cycle, that kind of requirement that you navigate that intersection was suddenly applied to everyone in a more broad way. I think it can be difficult to sort of muster the energy to do your job every day. It's hard to be a journalist. It's hard to keep up with a 24-hour news cycle. It's harder when the news is upsetting constantly. And it's harder still when there's a sense that the public doesn't believe in your role as a journalist and is in some cases just, you know, thinks that you are not truthful and that you're not you know, pursuing the news in an honest way, in a way that aligns with journalistic values that are longstanding.
I mean, yeah, you talked in your piece about just even physical, you know, the physical fallout of this that everybody is experiencing. This notion of like, and you've seen this a lot play out with journalists doing their jobs, you know, and covering the news, but then trying to use social media to sort of think through and parse through sort of what they think about all this and what it means to them and how they think other people should think about it, which newsrooms have had a hard time managing. Some newsrooms, the New York Times has instituted rules about this. How well do you think, how is that still really muddy in your mind?
I mean, social media, I think, is sort of necessarily muddy by definition. But I think, I mean, watching news break and then reacting on social media is kind of what those platforms are built for. It's more complicated for us as reporters. I think it's been difficult to sort of remedy these two spaces that we exist in. So, for example, if you are a person who belongs to a community who is the target of rhetoric from the Trump administration, if you, during the campaign, are a Mexican-American journalist, if you are an immigrant from anywhere, if you are a black person, if you are a woman, and sort of you have all of these things coming at you, you experience those as a person in the world, and then you experience them as a reporter. And the rules are different for those two identities, but you are one, but you've got one Twitter account, one Twitter handle, and so it's a sort of reactions from both of those sides happening all at the same time. And so we've seen, leadership in newsrooms kind of try to contain that in ways that I don't think that there's agreement about the best way to do that, about, when do you draw the line as far as, determining what journalists can and can't say, particularly as we increasingly place value on having diverse voices in newsrooms. And so what good is it if we make all this fuss about it and bring people in and then we contain their speech once they're in there? So I don't think that there's really an agreement about the best way to do that just yet.
Just a note, we want to leave time for any questions that you have. So if you want to start thinking through that in a couple minutes, we'll open it up to the floor. Alex, I want to bring it back to this thing that we talked about briefly with Paul about what is it that is going to make people care about this subject? Alex Ellerbeck.
Oh.
Sorry. How do we make people care? And I know this is something that CPJ thinks a lot about, sort of like, how do we connect these issues with people who aren't inclined to really have much interest in journalism, but they do sort of live in the world and they read what we write. So how do you make the connection?
I think there's a part of the population that has really started to care about press freedom in a way that they hadn't before. You see, I think, a slight uptick in media trust in media recently, though it tends to come from one side of the political aisle. And, we've seen more grassroots engagement with people interested in press freedom. The issue is that there's this other large segment of the population that either doesn't care or really distrusts the media. And figuring out how to reach them is difficult. I think, one thing is making sure that we make the case not as, oh, poor us, we're journalists, and we're facing threats, and that's bad, even though it is, but what does that mean for democracy? What does that mean for them? If the governor doesn't let the media interview him, or if he denies a FOIA, or if a FOIA request is denied, or, that means that the public is not getting information. That means that the people that they're paying their taxes to are doing things behind closed doors that they don't get to know about. And I think we need to do a better job making that case. And then, for the trust element, I think a lot of newspapers, a lot of media outlets have really been thinking hard about that. You see more places showing their work. There was a survey that came out and said a surprising percentage of the population thought that when journalists used the phrase anonymous sources, it meant that the journalist didn't know who the source was, which, which is concerning, right? And so I think there's been more work in sort of spelling out, behind the scenes, how are we doing this work? Why should you trust us? What's actually happening when we cite an anonymous source, and why are we doing that? And I think that's been valuable.
Any questions from the floor yet? There's a microphone right up here.
Hi. Oh my goodness, I sound awful. I always sound like a Bill Gates on steroid when I visit. Anyway, thanks so much, and it makes me think about journalism a lot. I teach public policy at York University, so I'll ask something that kind of maybe sound a bit academic. We talk about care and trust. How to make your audience, your readers, care about what you do and trust you as the source of information. Is the following a dilemma? That is, on one hand, if you give them what they want, then they will get what they want, but they may not trust you. For example, I'm old, so I lived through, Jennifer Flowers, Paula Jones, and then in 2016, the media got Stormy Daniels, but it wasn't like that. So the audience didn't get exactly the dirt as much as before, and so the audience might not be happy. On the other hand, if you don't give them what they want, but give them what they need, like for example, today, the Trump administration released the budget document, and is, as expected, tremendous spending cuts because with the tax cuts, money doesn't grow on trees, so you got to cut somewhere, and then that's kind of the boyhood dream of Paul Ryan, just to destroy the welfare state. And so if you write about that, then the people, that's what they need, but they may not like you, they may not trust you, they may not like what you give them. And so how do you balance that? That is to, in a sense, satisfy your readers, to grab their attention, but also to provide useful, insightful information, especially in this day and age.
Thank you. I sort of saw two parts to what you were talking about. First is how inured we are to scandal, right? Stories that break today that would have sort of been the story of the year were done within a week. But then that's one issue. Then the second issue is, how do we sort of not get distracted from the drama and the palace intrigue? Reuters has, you guys decided last year to sort of focus on a number of sort of policy areas that were going to drive your coverage.
Yeah.
In part, it was aimed at getting out of the kind of like, following the inside drama in the White House, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of think about it under an umbrella. One thing that Steve launched and we tried to spread throughout the newsroom was this idea of the Trump effect, so that you could see there's so much noise around everything as it happens, right? But as the question got to, and you repeated, it's easy to lose track of that, right? Not only in scandals, but also on policy. He says he's going to eliminate X number of regulations, right? But that's fine. What does that actually mean, right? And what does that actually look like in real life? How does that really play out? And I think that's one thing that we have tried to do, is to chronicle the effects of these policy shifts, right? As they filter down to businesses, to other branches of government, to people. That is one way to really understand the impact of different policies, right? And I think covering policy is enormously important. It gets lost, as I was saying before, in the kind of palace intrigue of coverage of the Trump administration. I think the other part of that question is a really interesting element to what's happened, which is that events that would be scandalous and events that would dominate headlines for days and weeks and potentially months disappear in 12 hours. I mean, I was saying to my wife the other night in the kitchen, I said that I wish I had a whiteboard and I could just every week write down the 3 or 4 or 5 major things that happened that week, because I myself as an editor forget them, right? I cannot remember now what was the driving scandal of a month ago, but there sure as hell was one, right? I mean, there is every single week, and we forget that and we go past that, and I think that's enormously dangerous, right? I think that
what do you mean dangerous?
Well, I mean, these are really important issues, right? I mean, they're really important things that happen. And to give it coverage for 24 hours and then to have your attention usurped by some other really enormous important thing, right? And to bounce over that, and then to lurch 24 hours later to something else that seems really important. None of it resonates with the reader. I mean, the average reader's like me; they can't remember one thing to the next, right? I mean, the Stormy Daniels example is it's a great example. Like, that's gone, right? That's gone. I'm not saying that would have changed the face of the republic, right? But that's a relatively big story, right? That potentially the President of the United States had a liaison with an adult film star, and then there was perhaps a payoff to keep her quiet right before. Like, I mean, that's a big story, right? And it just sort of disappears, right? And then we're on to the next thing. I think the fact that these don't gain as much traction as they should is problematic. But again, it is also the environment we live in, right? Things do move very, very quickly, right? And if you latch onto that, there's 4 other things that you miss in the meantime. So how, with the newsrooms that we have, do we collectively get our arms around all of that? It's a challenge.
We'll talk later this afternoon about the role of Facebook and Twitter in that. Other questions? Yep.
Yeah, I'm curious how you approach the issue of emotional stamina. Oh, sorry. Hi, sorry about that. How do you approach the issue of emotional stamina? How do you steel yourself emotionally without sort of, bless you, without inuring yourself to what's going on around you? Like, you don't want to become deaf to it, but you want to protect yourself. How do you do that?
Alex, you want to take that?
I think the conclusion of my piece is I don't know yet. I mean, I think my experience and the experience of friends who are working on a variety of different beats is we're sort of, I mean, it's very much trial and error. I think it's really, really difficult to disengage from the news. I mean, part of that is, it's my job to not disengage from the news. This is what we do. But even when you're starting to feel overwhelmed, even when the news is upsetting, even when the news, when you've got some personal stake in something, some policy that's being discussed or what have you, to walk away from the news makes it really hard for me to do my job. Twitter, for example, I was having a conversation with a friend last night, and he asked, how long can you stay off of Twitter? And I was like, well, I really can't. If I, just put my phone down and stay off of Twitter for 2 hours, and there's, I mean, on some days, then I've missed, that puts me back 4 hours because so much is happening so quickly. So, I mean, I don't know. Part of that has been just saying out loud to other reporters, to your editors sometimes, that you're having a rough time. Sometimes it's just accepting that I'm going to put my phone down for a little bit today, and tomorrow's going to be rough catching up, but I'm just going to have to do it. And, sometimes you put it down and really regret it the next day when you show up at work. But I don't think that there is sort of a clear-cut remedy that works for everyone. And I think that is sort of the problem, is figuring out how do I maintain my own mental health and also be present enough so that I can do my job well.
I do think this is one area where newsroom managers need to sort of catch up, because I think there's sort of been this view that, well, the answer is you just go to work. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's true, but I think that it doesn't acknowledge that there are other people who are really, the reporters who are really having a hard time trying to navigate all this.
And I think it's important also to constantly remind ourselves that we're all sort of stuck in this frenetic news cycle that never ends, and everything that is happening to everyone, but it's not happening equally to everyone. And so I think sometimes we get into these conversations about threats against the press as a community, and it is a community, but things are quite different. I had a friend of mine that I wrote about who is a Muslim immigrant and a writer also, and so on the day that the first travel ban was signed, that was a really rough day, I think, for a lot of people. It was demonstrably rougher for her than it was for me. And I think it's really important to just to kind of remember those things, as we're figuring this all out. It's hard, but some days are harder for certain people. And the idea of intersectionality, I think, is really, really crucial.
Other questions? All the way in the back?
Hi, this is a question for Alexandria. Thanks for sharing all your insights about reporter burnout. I've never actually heard about it. It was really interesting. My question was, as somebody, you just mentioned intersectionality, which is something important to be considering, but also the importance of having the public trust media. So in situations like that, how can you appropriately report in as unbiased of a way as possible while acknowledging the opinions of communities who are affected and being inclusive of those opinions as well, but also, seeming unbiased when it's really easy to be emotionally invested in certain topics?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's definitely, a top challenge. The way that I've approached it, and I think, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but, there's this concept of like objectivity, right? And so this is the problem when you hear criticism of the press and when you have conversations with people who don't trust media, that word gets thrown around a lot. And I think perhaps thinking carefully about what we mean when we say objectivity. I think sometimes the word is used as a synonym for a state of neutrality or a state of having no opinion. And we all have opinions. We all have a variety of different identities. And so we experience things and we feel things and we are impacted by things. And to deny that, I think, is counterproductive. I think a better word is fairness. And that's one that I try to use more than this kind of muddy, misunderstood concept of objectivity. You can acknowledge that you have, I'm a Black woman, and so there are things that are going to affect me and that I'm going to react to as a Black woman, no matter what, and I can't change those things. But I can say that, and I can acknowledge that, and then I can be. I can try really, really hard to make sure that I'm reporting things in a fair way and that I'm being transparent about the fact that whatever policy, whatever scandal, whatever it is, that perhaps there's some stake in this that I might experience, on a Saturday when I'm not in the newsroom. And I feel like that's kind of the best way right now that we have to do that is to really strive to be as transparent as you can and to be as fair as you can, but not to pretend like we are of no opinions. That's not human. So
We have time for one more question right over here.
Have any of you covered the Clinton administration during the Monica Lewinsky scandals? And if so, how could you compare the difference between then and now?
Paul?
I didn't. No, I didn't.
No, sorry. Jeff will tell you in the next panel. Anybody else? All the way in the back. We're all about transparency up here.
I wondered about the force of Trump sort of creating more news. There's just more news to cover. And maybe if we had more reporters to throw at it, we could cover it all. But in fact, are there fewer reporters now because of the economics of journalism? And if so, is that part of the problem? Keeping up with Trump because of the pressures on journalism itself?
There are fewer reporters, especially at the local level, where there's a lot fewer outlets. But, Alex?
Yeah, so CPJ, along with a number of other partner organizations, did a press freedom mission to the U.S. recently, and we traveled to Texas and Missouri, and we talked to local reporters. And I think, we talked a lot about these threats. We talked about to journalists who'd been arrested. We talked to journalists who couldn't get access to the State House. But underlying all of it, the overwhelming threat that people kept talking about was this economic insecurity. We visited newsrooms that it was just depressing because it would be a giant newsroom, but it would be empty because there had been so many layoffs. And when you have that economic insecurity, it becomes a lot harder to deal with both the sort of constant influx of news, but also challenges like legal assaults or your journalist getting arrested or whether to fight a FOIA denial.
Yeah, this is the big fear about this trickle-down rhetoric, is that there are a lot fewer reporters at the state and local level to write about what's going on in the State House, write about what's going on in the City Council, and there's a lot of interesting efforts being floated around to try to build that back up again, and I know it's happening in Canada as well. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave that there for now, and we're not going to even take a break. The format is we're going to shift now to talk about how all this is playing out around the world, and then after that discussion, we'll have time for a coffee break, and then we'll talk about a specific case study of threats against journalists. Thank you all very much. It was terrific hearing you. I'm going to be joined now by Courtney Rash, who's the Advocacy Director for CPJ and previously worked for the New York Times, the Daily Star, and Al Arabaya. Courtney.
Maybe some of you are hearing for the first time about the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I thought I would just tell you a bit about what we do so you understand a bit about what we're going to talk about here. So we systematically track the killing and imprisonment of journalists and basically act like a news service for attacks on the press. And one of the things that we're seeing is that it continues to be a very dangerous time for being a journalist. Now, thankfully, we have seen fewer journalists killed in the past couple of years, primarily because there haven't been as many new violent conflicts starting. But we have seen record numbers of journalists imprisoned. And as my colleague Alex Ellerbeck, that is referred to, we also work in partnership with organizations around the world to do advocacy on behalf of journalists who are under threat. And this year, we did a mission to the United States for the first time ever with a group of international organizations. Usually, we've done these missions to places like Turkey, which is the world's leading jailer of journalists, or to Azerbaijan, or to Uganda, or elsewhere where the press are under threat. But we had to come to the United States to really understand what the situation is here, but also because the U.S. plays such an important role around the world. And you heard someone mention earlier this idea that the United States is a beacon, and it truly is. It is a beacon, and we have seen around the world a deterioration in the environment and the ecosystem in which journalists are working. So not only have we seen record imprisonments, but we saw the number of journalists imprisoned on false news charges more than double since 2016 and go from 2 countries, Egypt and Ethiopia, that use those charges to jail journalists to 6 countries. We've seen that non-state actors continue to murder journalists with impunity, and that corruption is by far one of the leading causes of death among journalists. Most of those who were murdered last year were covering corruption. And although we're seeing in many countries, we have seen a decline in the killing of journalists, we've actually seen Mexico, a democratic country, an exception to that rule, where we saw 6 journalists killed last year. And we're seeing that, even in many of these countries where we're seeing record levels of murder, in many cases it's so difficult to find out why they're being targeted that we have to include them as missing journalists. This is the case in Mexico, in Iraq, in Yemen. And I think that when we see this decrease in murders, we're not sure why. We know there is maybe a bit less violent conflict, but many of these conflicts continue. We've still got Iraq, Yemen, Syria, et cetera. But we wonder, what is the intimidation effect? So when you look at rising number of journalists imprisoned, you look at the proliferation of this fake news rhetoric around the world being used by leaders to justify their repression. And then, of course, we see, as was alluded to, the economic impact. And tied up in that is the technological situation for the news media. It's hard to talk about the global threat environment without also speaking about what is the technology and the sensorial impact of what's happening as these major online platforms attempt to deal with things like fake news or terrorism online. So with that, I'd like to turn first to Jeff to talk a bit about how you and your role from Al Jazeera, but also as the most the past National Press Club president, how you saw this as a, from your vantage point as an international journalist working in the U.S. for an organization that has reporters around the world.
Thank you, Courtney. First, I want to thank Columbia Journalism Review and Kyle Pope, who I testified with before Congress last summer, defending a free press, and the Committee to Protect Journalists, Joel and Courtney and everybody else there, and Reuters, Stephen Adler and Jim Smith, who I've had the privilege, the CEO, I've had the privilege to deal with on many occasions, usually on the press freedom front, and everybody else who extended the invitation. You mentioned the two hats that I wear. First, at Al Jazeera, and even before President Trump was elected, we had colleagues imprisoned in Egypt for over a year. And we thank our colleagues here at Reuters and a lot of other places that helped us get them free. That was a very ugly and intense experience that we'd rather not revisit. Unfortunately, we have revisited it because our colleague Malcolm Hussein has been in prison now 419 unacceptable days in Egypt. So my colleague Daniel Lack is all the way in the back from Al Jazeera, and our correspondent who's based here, and we know that this is like a bad nightmare. And doesn't always necessarily hang it on Trump, but well, the whole notion that in my other world, and that I just completed service as president of the National Press Club, where we were able to join forces with CPJ and CJR and RTE DNA and the White House Correspondents Association and everybody else. We participated in the Press Freedom Tracker through our Journalism Institute, and we looked at these various issues domestically, and for our purposes at the club, we also looked abroad. And we also did the same, we take those issues seriously at Al Jazeera because to the theme of the panel, the ethos that President Trump, first candidate and now as leader of the free world, has brought to bear, that he has set, and this is alluded to in the first panel, as the beacon of a free press, he's undermined that literally from day one. And that has sent a global signal to everybody else, well, if Donald Trump can do it, so can we. So Egypt, Libya, Mexico, Turkey, and to our hosts here at Reuters, sadly, Myanmar. Everybody feels like they can have open season on us. And that's a very dangerous place to be. While it may be more rhetorical, and in some off-crazy cases like Gianforte and others, down to the State House and the domestic level, on the global level, it has deadly consequences. More jailings, more harassment. Fortunately, killing is down a little bit, as if that's supposed to be a real happy thing. But the notion from Al Jazeera, our colleagues are in harm's way every single day.
But do you find that they are experiencing it more, that it's more difficult for them to report? Are they hearing this rhetoric? Do they hear it on the ground?
Yeah, we hear it on the ground all the time. I mean, it's not just for covering Trump rallies or, there's a notion that people, you can't necessarily connect the dots because we don't have empirical data to prove it. But when we're out there, there are a lot of dangerous places in the world. And a lot of people, and you hear a lot of mimic leaders, whether they're democratically elected or whether they're not, that are mimicking the language of fake news, a term I despise, by the way, but that's another discussion. And all these other things that sort of control information. prevent people from having access, for people from thriving. It's not just keeping, on the domestic side, the White House correspondents pull out of the briefing room or out of a pool spray. It is intimidating journalists writ large in various parts of the world from to being able to cover the simple things. And you're even seeing it, watching the White House press corps coming over to cover Pence, and how they were treated as they were covering him during his recent trip to cover the Olympics and other parts of his recent travels, of how sort of the elbow, very sort of rough and tumble antics of the governments abroad. So.
Yeah, and I think we have been just tracking it internally because we constantly make this point at the Committee to Protect Journalists because of the importance that the U.S. plays, and we've seen in Cambodia that using the excuse of fake news and restrictions on access to kick out Radio Free Asia. We've seen in Egypt that there are, restrictions on what information can be reported about terrorism, and you can get charged under false news statutes if it doesn't adhere to what the official Ministry of Interior numbers are. We've seen it in Russia, but we've also seen it, as you said, in democratic countries like Poland and in Hungary, where this idea of fake news is a great way to dismiss the press. And I think one of the things that we've also seen is this proliferation of false news statutes around the world, which are often looking at online news. And I think in many of the countries that we're very concerned about, where you have the press under constant attack, where they are getting killed or imprisoned in a relatively regular basis, the power of online platforms as a way to disseminate news is even more important. And we're going to talk about the issue of trust in media. But first I want to talk about the importance that these platforms play in getting out the news, the power that they have. And yet we're seeing more and more journalists being jailed, arrested for what they publish online. And we're also hearing about censorship, for example, on, maybe you can tell us a bit about what happened in Myanmar, what happened in Syria with the videos coming out of there. Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, Facebook, let's face it, is a massive double-edged sword. In fact, if there's a sword that has more than two edges, Facebook is that sword, because there are things that are tremendously powerful. I mean, in Myanmar or any number of different countries, Facebook in particular has become the way to get the real message, the real news to people, because the state media is corrupt, because the government represses everything under the sun. So social media, and particularly Facebook, because it's so ubiquitous, is a way to get that message out. Unfortunately, that then sets up a whole pattern where Facebook now controls the news. And so the risk is Facebook decides to do things related to the news for its own purposes. Facebook, I think, recently has started talking about journalism and quality news and so on. That's like literally in the last half hour in terms of the life of Facebook. So that's a relatively recent thing. Facebook has always claimed that we're a neutral platform. We just distribute the stuff that you want to see, and yet they continually censor content and then deny that they did it or don't say why. This is a hugely problematic institution to effectively have become the central news delivery system for entire nations. So when I reported on, I interviewed a few journalists who were working in Myanmar, Cambodia, and when Facebook did its split newsfeed test, has everybody heard of that? So Facebook did an experiment where they split the news feed so that you got all your personal stuff in the regular news feed, and news, traditional news, was separate in a separate feed called Discover. So of course nobody went there. And in Myanmar in particular, and Cambodia I think, Facebook had taken on such a huge role that doing that changed the information consumption of an entire country, effectively. And Facebook was treating it as though it was an A/B test on like the color of their logo or something. Oh, let's just experiment and we'll switch the newsfeed around. But this has affected effectively the way people see their government, their lives in a tremendously powerful way. So I don't think Facebook has appreciated that. I think we're just starting to appreciate that. Those are the things we're having to sort of grapple with when it comes to Facebook effectively being a news entity.
And, I think especially in countries like Myanmar, where you have restricted access, like Syria, one of the things I heard in writing my own column for CGR was about Syria, where you have citizen journalists and citizen media outlets who have become were the only way to get information out of Syria. And there was a massive amount of censorship of their YouTube videos. So hundreds of thousands of YouTube videos affected by what appeared to be some sort of algorithmic shift designed to counter violent extremism online. But what the impact was that removed all of this critical reporting.
And let's face it, it's not just Facebook. I mean, Google, YouTube, Twitter, they all do it. And in many cases, they don't like to talk about it. So I know Elliot Higgins, who's been just an incredible information resource about Syria, was talking years ago about Facebook removing entire pages that had to do with the conflict in Syria. And by doing that, they were removing effectively information about what the government was doing, information that journalists rely on, information that would not have gotten out otherwise. YouTube is the same. They're making these decisions for their purposes because they want the platform to be this way or that way. But they're having an incredibly powerful impact on the world, on the way people see the...
And you've also had media organizations either fully, disseminating becoming essentially Facebook news organizations, or evolving their businesses to really take advantage of Facebook. And Madeline, I want to go to you to talk about both the economic dimension, but also the trust dimension. We're in a situation where media organizations are under, severe economic threats pretty much around the world. They're having to adapt the logic of, their news gathering and dissemination to the technology platforms. But at the same time, there's this real crisis of trust. What do we do?
Can you solve that?
Oh, well,
She gets this $1 million question.
No, it is an important point to keep in mind that before Trump came along, before the Trump effect happened, that the media business was already in trouble, was very weak. The business model was part of it when Matthew and I have talked about this before, that in fact Facebook and Google were eating the regular media organizations' lunch because they were bringing in all the advertising dollars. So that really weakened the media organizations to take on some of these problems that have come along with Trump. But the other factor is trust. And I think we forget, it's been mentioned a few times, but this is something that's long-standing. When we talk about how do we engage the audiences, we've lost a lot of the audiences already. I mean, it's not going to be simply a question of, telling them in a different manner that a free press is good for you, because some of them aren't listening to us anymore. So that goes back to how do we regain the trust and how do we fix the business model, and there isn't an easy answer. But because this is supposed to be an international panel, I will mention 3 international bits here. We were talking about trickle down before. Whether it is trickling down, it certainly is. Trump's rhetoric is been adopted by some of the conservatives in Canada. And I went to a conference of conservatives within the last year where every session talked about fake news and everyone was all stirred up about journalists. I have never experienced that in 40 years of reporting in Canada. I have never felt that I was in a hostile environment as a journalist before. So that is having an impact. I don't want to go on too long here. I've got a minute to give 2 international examples. I have done a fair amount of work with journalists, mostly in Africa, but some in Asia before. And I'm looking at this in terms of the question of trust. The reason that journalism loses trust of readers is different depending on what country you're in. And for example, I was in Zambia, and there journalists are horribly underpaid. And there was a whole culture of them, they called it the brown envelope culture, which is not the same thing as we consider brown envelopes, but this is money that they would get if they would go and cover a government announcement or a company announcement. Now, you can see why that happened, but it was very widely known that journalists were accepting money, and so hence trust in the journalist was, and what they were reporting was quite low. And in Rwanda, when I was working with journalists there, it was a different problem. Someone who Trump probably took notes from, Kagame, and his government, very authoritarian, and it came out that many journalists were actually on the government payroll to write favorable stories about the Kagame government. So again, they were losing trust for those reasons. So when we go to ask the question, okay, well, how are we going to restore trust in the media? It's different depending on what country you're in and where they are in this particular cycle.
And in a way, I think you could say Trump tapped into something that already existed. It's not like he created this crisis of trust. He tapped into it because he knew it was there. And he's fed it like a fire, just poured wood on and gas on. And so it's arguably bigger than it has been. But it existed, has existed.
And I want to piggyback on the economic, the brown envelope culture, as you call it, because it's a different sort of trust. In Latin America, we have a very strong presence throughout Latin America at Al Jazeera. And what we've discovered, not just through them, but through specifically when I was president of the press club last year, is that we had one of our Press Freedom Award winners, Emilio Gutierrez Soto, who accepted our John Aubuchon Award for Press Freedom. John Aubuchon is a past president of the club. He fled Mexico in part because he was covering corruption. He exposed corruption in the Mexican government and in the military a decade ago, and he's been living here. But one of the things he mentioned in his acceptance speech was the fact that there were some of his colleagues who were indeed on the take, on the government take, and you go throughout some of the countries, some of the battles in countries like Venezuela and other places where who actually owns a particular outlet drives the coverage, and that's something you have to study very carefully. I mean, it's a relatively new phenomenon in the States because there's a lot of talk about how Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch built the Fox empire and how they made it a nice, in many respects, a partisan weapon. But that old trick's been around for a long, long time, as you mentioned. And Emilio is trying to fight for asylum in the United States because he knows, and in fact, you talk about Trump policy, his immigration policy is a direct effect on this because his Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, snapped him up because he was trying to press his asylum case. They handcuffed him, they threw him in the hole, and they tried to intimidate him and break him down and make him beg to get sent back to Mexico, where, of course, he would be shot to death or probably decapitated or something else, he and his son. So the Trump effect is different because of immigration policy, because somebody is running from Mexico where there's corruption, and he's trying not to go back there and trying to still report, trying to still get freedom of the press out. And he's sort of the embodiment of those who are trying to struggle and report and keep an independent and free press going in places like Mexico. To your other point about that there's nothing new under the sun that Trump tapped into, and this goes to the last panel, and this is something that Kyle sort of indicated I probably should raise, and that is the comparison in terms of, yes, I was in the press corps in the mid-'90s covering Bill Clinton, and when impeachment went down. And one of the things I definitely noticed then, but I really notice now, is the notion of the shift in the profession and the shift in what I call peripheral media, which is not necessarily journalistically. For example, when I started in the business, I started in talk radio. Talk radio was a very sort of sleepy, leather couch, sports scores, recipes, profession, sort of non-journalistic aspect. The partisanship weaponized talk radio and turned that into sort of a till for shaping the soil to create a fertile ground for ultra-partisanship. And it just grew from there. But what you saw were partisan press on both the left and the right emerging, especially on the right during the Clinton years, and the left caught up belatedly. You saw that gave birth to helping to shape what eventually became the contract with America, because that sort of partisan ground, and you can see that, I mean, this is a domestic point, but to answer the question from the earlier panel, helped shape school boards, town councils, state legislatures, and eventually Congress. And it caught the Democrats flat-footed. 40 years of power gone. So, but that sense of taking over should all, going back to the global sense. I guess my mic just went dead. Is the sense of lessons aren't really learned until you stop making the mistakes of ignoring them, and to ignore in this case the lessons of history for journalists is fatal. We have to study what happened in both domestic and the global side so we can understand how to convey this to our viewers, to our readers, to our listeners. And if we don't do this with a sense of perspective, a sense of context, then those who pay attention to us are going to lose trust in us because we're not.
And I would say that's one of the problems with something like Facebook. Nothing like Facebook has ever existed before. There is no historical analogy except like maybe the Catholic Church in the 9th century or so. There's never been an entity that controlled as much information for as many people ever.
Right.
So there's lots of times I think journalists and particularly media organizations don't know what to do because there's never been anything like that. You can't go back and look at how the Washington Post dealt with the Facebook of the 50s or whatever. There's just no...
Well, I wonder if we should be thinking about looking at, previous eras of, corporate dominance of the media. But I think going back to what something that Jeff said, this idea of who owns the media and the idea of partisanship. So I used to work as a journalist in the Middle East and worked for Al Arabiya, which is a Saudi-owned, Emirates-based news organization. And everyone who watches it and everyone who works there knows that, on certain foreign policy issues, you're going to have a certain perspective and you're not going to cover Saudi women's rights. But most people know that. Same in Lebanon, where you have a very partisan press, very affiliated with political, socio-religious groups. But again, and in Egypt as well, talking to news consumers there who consume, those who do consume the news usually would, read a variety of different papers, look at different shows, because they know that each outlet represents a certain viewpoint. So is that the direction that maybe we're headed? Should we try to, more fully identify what who is the owner behind this? What is the interest of, what is the political affiliation? Is that helpful, or does that turn, does that put journalists into the middle of...
And I would argue, I don't know, Madeline probably has an opinion too, but I would argue that that kind of viewpoint of your media industry is much more common in other countries than it is in North America, where lots of countries you go to that nobody trusts this outlet specifically. There's ones that they're aligned to ideologically, but everybody knows this paper is for this guy, and this paper is for this party, and that paper is owned by this billionaire. And so I think people are, maybe there's less trust, but maybe that's actually a good thing.
I think it would certainly help if news organizations that have a leaning disclose it more clearly. You were talking about transparency before, and that's one of the things that when you look at why the media has lost trust, because certainly in the North American context, people think that they have hidden biases and hidden agendas and that. So if you're upfront with your agenda, then at least you've gotten rid of part of that lack of trust. But I want to get back to something you said about Facebook, because if you go back in history, there's actually things that have happened that give me a bit of optimism that we're not going to be stuck here
Great, we
forever.
could use some.
Okay.
We're just wondering who was the optimist.
Yeah, I'm the optimist in the crowd. No, I did some research into journalism in Canada about a year ago, and so I talked to a media historian who cheered me up immensely, because he was talking about what had happened in Canada, and I think mostly the same thing happened in the States and in Western Europe, in that maybe 100, 150 years ago, everyone was publishing their own pamphlet, a lot of them anonymous, right? Which is sort of similar to the environment we're in now. And then along came a few of the pamphleteers who figured out that if they could corner the advertising from what were then growing stores, if they could do that, then they could put everybody else out of business, and theirs would be the newspaper, the journal that everyone would read. So we went from having many voices to having many fewer voices, much more streamlined. Then along comes the internet, and all of a sudden there's an explosion in voices again. And then along comes...
And then comes Facebook.
Facebook.
Yeah. So you're saying it's cyclical?
Well, it's looking like that. And the problem is I can't say, and then along comes this, and it will, broaden it out again. But some other innovation could easily undermine the power of Facebook, and then we're left with a much more open discussion again.
And that's a fair point. I mean, looking back at things that are similar in some ways, I look at the early days of newspapers when, a city like San Francisco had 15 newspapers, because everybody had a newspaper. So this guy had a newspaper and that guy had a newspaper. And so you had a lot more, I think, variety in a way, and no one took a specific newspaper as being the voice of God in the same way I think a lot of people do for the New York Times or for whoever. So maybe that environment, it's more chaotic for sure, and readers I think have to do a lot more work, but maybe it was actually better.
Well, also, I would just want to bring in, to go back to the global dimension, Al Jazeera for a decade played a very critical role in the Middle East and globally. You watch Al Jazeera English, particularly the range of issues that's covered on there, Al Jazeera Arabic, the range of issues it covered compared to the domestic media until it started to catch up, played a really key role. And then, of course, we saw last year this retaliation where the media organization was put in the middle of the geopolitical
crisis between Saudis,
Emiratis,
and there was
and
an
Qatar.
economic crisis.
But it was an economic crisis because the price of petrol, a bunch of things that happened in the region. But what you had that can't get in all the weeds. It's a bit above my pay grade, but but it's not out of school to say what everybody has seen, that it was clear, and we reported on the crisis ourselves, that it was weird that somehow a journalism organization gets tossed into the middle of a discussion, because when you really dig deep enough, there are those in the Emirati world that just simply do not like Al Jazeera because we ask hard questions. We step on toes.
But this came after Trump's visit.
This, of course,
right?
Yes, but you can't really just hang it on Trump, because this is an issue that's been out there if you've studied the region for a while.
Right.
It just happened to really blow up after the Trump visit, but the GCC crisis is something that was a long time in the making.
But Trump does that. He taps into that stuff, and he throws grenades that he knows are going to land.
Saudis haven't liked Al Jazeera in a long time.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we hear more and more, and it seems to be a trend, is one of the issues of kind of journalism under Trumpism is you had a lot of trends that started before the economic crisis, these various crises, et cetera, didn't start under Trump, but he's thrown a match onto them.
Yeah, like you're talking about moving CENTCOM, which happens to be where? In Qatar. I mean, why would you even take the one of the most significant military bases in the region and try to throw a match into the gasoline pile and say, oh, we'll just take care of CENTCOM. And so what about the rest of the region? What does the protection of that region look like, and where does CENTCOM go?
And I would say both Trump and Facebook have, in a sense, weaponized that sort of lack of trust. Facebook for economic reasons, Trump because he's insane, and I don't actually know his reasons because I'm not sure there are any. But Facebook, did it because it worked. Facebook did it because they just want you to engage. They just want you to spend time on the platform. So fundamentally, they don't care, I don't think. Recently, I think they've suggested they care, but fundamentally, they just want you to click and share. And what's really engaging is garbage.
One of the things, Courtney, I want to bring up is often there are reporter exchanges. Western reporters often go to different parts of the world to help strengthen journalism organizations in countries which are struggling to maintain a free press often. And when you have the proliferation of what has happened in the Western world under Trump, and the economic pressures, when you throw in the partisanship, you ask yourself, and we ask ourselves to be the beacon of a free press in the States, what are we exporting? And what are we asking our colleagues around the world to emulate? And that should raise a whole lot of questions about how we conduct ourselves as a profession in terms of, yes, I believe in a free market, but there's a free market, and then you can't be having either CBJ or CJR, or in some cases even the State Department sends journalists around the world. How do you do that and make sure that what we're exporting is the best of us and not the worst of us?
The U.S. used to be a beacon. Look what we do. This is what you should do. Now the U.S. is like, what should we do? You've experienced somebody like Trump. What should we do?
I'm just hoping, can I just make this one comment, that in looking for solutions on how to deal with Trump, that we realize that we have to address the fundamental problems that he is actually latched onto, rather than address the solutions just to Trump.
I want to open it up for questions. If you can raise your hand, they'll bring you a mic. And while the mic is getting to you, I just want to raise this issue of beacon, because we depend at the Committee to Protect Journalists on the U.S. to stand up for press freedom at the United Nations in its bilateral relationship, to bring up cases, put pressure on Mexico to solve impunity. It's very hard to do that when you have, a president with this sort of rhetoric and, the lack of normative power there. So please go ahead.
Thank you for an amazing talk. My question more has to do with poverty of local news, and that's actually a phrase from Ryerson University. There's a researcher in Canada who's looking into it and who has documented the poverty of local news. So my question is specific to Madeline and Matthew. In terms of improving citizen engagement, how do you think local news can be improved in Canada? And specifically for you, Matthew, and Madeline as well, and everyone, how do you think digital startups can play a role in that space? And how do you think that they'll take on organizations like Facebook? Thank you.
Wow.
How much time do we
have? That's a hefty question.
I'm aware of the research that you're talking about that's being done, and it's very important to document local news and how news organizations are disappearing. But there's another side of it that I would also like to see, which is are there people getting their local news in other ways? That's more difficult to capture, and yet I wonder if that demand for local news is being satisfied in some other ways, because then there may not be the need for all these local news outlets that we currently have right now. I know that in Ottawa, for example, there's a number of sites that have sprung up that, some are just devoted to entertainment, but others are more devoted to political news. So I'd like to see a survey of that before you can actually say local news is dead. I mean, often all these studies don't ask, are people being informed? That is the reason that free press is necessary for democracy. It's to inform the people. It's not just to exist on our own behalf. And I'd like to see more work done on, are people informed or not?
That's a great point, actually, that I think as journalists, we tend to look at oh, the local newspaper is not doing well, ipso facto journalism is not doing well. And I think there's a risk that we look at older traditional institutions and think that's journalism, and if that fails, then journalism fails. So I'm sure there are people getting lots of local journalism in new ways, and to sort of borrow some of Madeline's optimism, something I'm not normally inclined towards, I think there's such a huge potential. Digital tools are so much better than old-fashioned tools. In those old days when there were 15 newspapers, they had to print those stupid things on paper and then hand them out and stuff. It's ridiculous. And now there's just so much more potential to reach people in ways that matter to them, whether it's Snapchat or Instagram or email newsletters or whatever. And so I think there's not just journalists, but anyone who's interested in helping people understand what's going on around them should be doing as much as possible in as many different ways as possible. And yes, that includes Facebook. There's a guy, in fact, in New Jersey who runs what's effectively a local news entity on Facebook. There's no website, and it's fascinating the way he's been able to connect with the community. So we shouldn't ignore, I think, the power of that. I don't think we should hand everything over to Facebook, but
I think there's also a training component. I know we do a lot of training at the National Press Club through our Journalism Institute, and we talk about these issues. So we'd like to, you're hearing cooperation. You have a lot of cooperatives that are forming in some respects, not just micro journalism, but people are starting to link up and build partnerships. I don't know where that's going to lead, but that's part of the discussion.
And I mean, readers can help. Like, I don't think this whole sort of us journalists do the journalism and then we just give it to you and then we're done, that's our job. I think that has to stop. Like, if you, particularly on the local level, if you care about that community, they have to help you and they have to be involved, or it's not going to matter.
We have another question over here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of models out there. We have one in Halifax that's a total subscription model and serves a particular segment of the local audience very well. We have the Tyee out in Vancouver, which covers not only Vancouver, but British Columbia politics quite well. We have places like Thunder Bay where...
Sorry, can I ask you to ask your question? Sorry about that, just because we're running out of time. Let's move to the coffee break. Thank you so much.
I guess the question is, how do you spread the word about those things, and how do you make sure, especially in the case of foundation-supported initiatives, which there's been a lot more scrutiny of, that you don't simply run into the same problem that you had with politically driven support, that the organization, whatever it is, comes to be shaped, or their coverage comes to be shaped by the interests of the foundation rather than simple journalistic interests and the news interests of the public.
Yeah, that's a great question, please.
I think there is a lot of experimentation going on, and some of it is really exciting. And in fact, when I was doing my research into the future of journalism in Canada, there is an age divide. The older journalists are all depressed and worried. Younger journalists are more excited because there are more opportunities to do things. But I don't think anyone has hit on the perfect model yet. Otherwise, everyone else would be copying it. And I think the perfect model will probably involve, as Matthew was saying, more two-way, more engagement, but more than just engagement with the audiences, is more of a two-way street with them than there is right now. It won't be just journalists delivering the word from on high. It will be engaged with the people that they're trying to inform.
I'll be a bit more direct. If there are a lot of us, whether you're, cut a check to CPJ, cut a check to the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Public broadcasting depends on public support no matter where you are in this hemisphere. So if you want good journalism, you have to find a way to support it. And that's just one angle for it.
And I think you raise a really critical point. We've seen in Hungary, for example, that there's been this, anti-Soros campaign, and they're already. I'm sure many of you saw the article about the democratic decline there. Much of it has been led by the attacks on press freedom over the past almost decade now. And often you see these, the decline in local journalism, the restrictions on press freedom, preceding some of these broader crackdowns. And in many cases, in many countries, you don't have that domestic subscriber base that you might have in countries like Canada or the US. And so they do depend on foundation funding, and I think that is a big challenge. I want to thank everyone, for this very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. I think we covered most parts of the world. I believe now I'll turn it over to Kyle.
I just want to introduce Joel Simon, who's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. CPJ was our partner in the production of a print issue that you'll see on your way out about threats, and it's the first time we've done a sort of joint production of a magazine with a group like this, and it was we were thrilled to be in partnership with CPJ, and are sort of awed by what CPJ does around the world. So I'll turn it over to Joel.
Right, well, likewise, Kyle, we were really thrilled to be a part of this. And I think I've been writing for CJR for about 20 some odd years. So I'm very closely connected to what CJR is and represents, and really excited to partner with you on this and on this discussion. And we've had a really far-ranging and interesting and broad discussion in the first two panels. And now we're going to dig down a little more deeply into a specific issue, and it's an issue that my colleague Courtney Raj outlined in the last panel, which is what happens when journalists are jailed. Now, unfortunately, that's happening a lot. As Courtney mentioned, last year, at the end of last year, we do an annual census at CPJ, and there were 262 journalists in jail around the world. That's the highest number we've ever recorded, and the previous high was the year before. So before we start our conversation, I want to give you a little bit of context, which is that this is a long-term trend. At the end of 2000, there were 81 journalists in jail around the world, and by the end of the following year, so in other words, following the September 11th attacks in 2001 and the launch of the War on Terror, there were 112. So it went from 81 to 112. And we've been on a steady upward trajectory ever since. We've seen surges in imprisonments of journalists around the world linked to major international events like the aborted Green Revolution in Iran. Following that, we saw a huge crackdown on the press there and a huge increase in the number of journalists around the world, the Arab Spring, and then in 2016, the aborted coup in Turkey. That led to a massive crackdown on the press in Turkey and a huge surge in the number of journalists in jail around the world. Clearly, autocratic leaders are threatened by information, and information's been harder to control and manage because technology, something that was talked about as a very much a double-edged sword in the last panel, but we have to acknowledge, has transformed the way that information and news is gathered and disseminated, and in many ways made it harder to control. And this threatens these kinds of autocratic regimes. And meanwhile, there's been this enduring rubric that has provided the framework for a long-term crackdown, which is, as I mentioned, began after 2001, and that's this anti-terror framework. And one important data point to keep in mind is that 74% of all journalists imprisoned around the world are jailed on anti-state charges. So that's the primary framework around the world under which journalists are jailed. Another important point, 97% of all journalists jailed around the world are local journalists working in their own countries. So this is primarily an issue that affects local journalists. Having said that, it is an issue that every international media organization confronts and has to consider, particularly in relation to its local staff. And all three of my colleagues on this stage have had to grapple with that issue. You've met Steve Adler, who is our host and introduced this discussion earlier. His colleague, Reg Schwa, who's the executive editor at Reuters.
It's a long title.
It's a long title. Okay. He's an important guy. He does lots of important things. And he's so important that his title is really long. And then my colleague, Kathleen Carroll, who also presented herself earlier, but is the board chair of CPJ. I'd like to start with Kathleen. And throughout your career at the AP, at CPJ, you really looked at this issue from every angle, dealing with your own journalists who face this, making coverage decisions about how this issues are covered, dealing with other news organizations. I wonder if you can just sort of draw from your own experience to frame this issue broadly and tell us what you've seen as a result of your efforts.
Sure. I think my long title doesn't include turning on the microphone. I think it's really important to think about a couple of things. One, there's not a magic playbook, although the numbers tell us that the vast majority of journalists who are jailed are local journalists, and they're on some kind of "you've offended the state and the state has an idea about how you should behave" charges. There is no playbook for what to do when that happens, whether you're a big international organization which has more resources and more potential avenues but also can be caught in the crossfire, or if you're a local organization. There's no go here, do this, expect a free hearing, a fair hearing, and expect a resolution. So you're every single time, no matter how many times you've been at this, you are trying to figure it out anew. And I know Stephen Ridge can talk about this as well. I would say the other thing that is true is that you cannot expect your colleagues in the profession to come to your defense. And in some places, the local journalists will indeed rally on behalf of one of their brethren who's in trouble. In North America, it's really piss poor. The organizations tend to put their own competitive issues in front. They think, well, it's not that interesting. Mostly they just don't think about it at all. They don't feel an obligation to the profession that would drive them to rally on behalf of someone who's jailed. So to me, those are the two biggest problems. And in the third, which Stephen Ridge can talk about as well, if you're in an international organization, as I was and many of you are, the ship has to keep sailing. You know, you've got a terrible crisis, and people that you care about who are in trouble, and you're not sure how you're going to get them out of it, and their families are terrified and horrified, and their colleagues are terrified and horrified, but you have to keep producing the news report. And you need to keep producing the news report that will help them, so their situation is part of your thinking every day. And you're trying to decide how to also keep, who else might be in jeopardy in what other place. You're trying to keep the rest of the staff safe, because some of them are really terrified when something happens to one of their colleagues. So that's like three really big, huge things, but all three of them any one of those three can consume a good part of your working life while you're trying to free your colleagues.
We're going to talk about these issues in relation to a very specific case that's sort of front and center for us at CPJ and obviously for Reuters, which is two of their journalists, Walon and Chia So-oh, who are imprisoned in Myanmar, facing very serious consequences and potential prosecution under that country's Official Secrets Act in reprisal for their reporting. And before we hear from Reg about the situation that they're confronting and some of the challenges that Reuters is facing in fighting for their liberty, their freedom, we're going to watch a video. So let's watch that now.
Bookish and brave, and now behind bars. The picture that emerges from friends and family of two Reuters journalists arrested in Myanmar.
Take two.
we go.
Yeah.
Bookish and brave, and now behind bars. The picture that emerges from friends and family of two Reuters journalists arrested in Myanmar is of warm-hearted, generous men who were committed to their work. That work included covering a fierce military crackdown, which has seen more than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims flee the country. Reuters' Andrew Marshall worked with both journalists.
Like all good reporters, Walloon and Choso'u are truth seekers, but they're seeking the truth in a country which is divided and turbulent. Even so, they've made a point of working without fear and without bias, and that's won them a lot of respect on all sides.
Walloon joined Reuters in July 2016 and had always dreamed of being a journalist.
But his parents were rice farmers. There wasn't enough money to go to college, so he lived in a monastery for a while. He started his own photo services business, and he just kept at it. And now he's working for one of the world's largest news organizations.
He also found time to write children's stories and co-founded a charitable foundation.
Walloon is a good husband to me, a good employee, and continues to learn. He's a real journalist. I believe he wouldn't do anything wrong. That's why I want him to be free as soon as possible.
Choso'u grew up in the restive Rakhine region, where attacks in August by Rohingya Muslim militants triggered the brutal military response.
He started out writing poetry and became a journalist as violence swept across Rakhine State, which is where he lives. He's a very quiet guy, but this hides a burning passion for journalism.
He had been working with Reuters since September and is described as a joyful person who has many friends. Both men are accused of violating Myanmar's colonial-era Official Secrets Act. Governments, including the US and Britain, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, and Reuters editor-in-chief Stephen Adler, as well as a host of journalists and human rights groups, have called the arrests an attack on press freedom.
Thank you. Reg, now I understand you were in Myanmar recently, and I wonder if you can give us an update on their situation and tell us about some of the efforts that Reuters is pursuing on their behalf.
So one of the things in my long title is I look after security, and sometime in December I got a call that nobody ever wants to get, which is 2 of our guys are missing, and we don't know where they are. We know they had dinner with some policemen, and then they didn't come out. And so they spent the whole night looking for them. We went to the police, and of course the police amazingly told us to file a missing persons report, even though they had them. And it was only about a day and a half after that we discovered, and only indirectly, frankly, that they were under arrest. And so at that point, you sort of just kick, everything sort of kicks into motion. We need to, as Kathleen has said, the ship needs to keep sailing, and you need to make sure that things are right. So, we sent in people to start making sure that we get lawyers, that we were in contact with the families, that the rest of the staff felt safe. People felt that for any reason they needed to be somewhere else. We would make sure that happened. And we had to keep the story going as well, because we needed to cover what was going on. So that took the better part of a week to get together. I went in right after that, met with the family, met with the lawyers, and started that whole process. And then, of course, since then, we've tried to make sure that the story stays top of mind, that we're getting comments from people. Obviously, there's been a lot of, as the video says, there's been a lot of international and domestic support as well for them. And so that's been very good to have, to sort of keep the case on the front burner. So at this point now, what's happened is that they're in this process where the prosecution is asking a court to bring charges. So they're not been charged. There's a whole series of hearings now where a court determines whether they should be charged under the Official Secrets Act. That's probably going to take a few months. They've been denied bail in that time. If at the end of that the court decides to go ahead with charges, then the trial begins, and that will be, again, at least several months. So we're looking at, unfortunately, what seems to be a sort of a protracted situation here. What's interesting in the court case so far is that we've seen all sorts of contradictions have come up. The military or the police have said now that they asked for permission to file the official secrets case against them 1 hour after they were arrested, which is quite amazing, considering that's barely enough time for you to process the evidence. I think one of the policemen that has been interviewed has said that he only recently reconstructed his notes after burning them after the arrest. And of course, I think one of the biggest things that had happened is that we published the story that Wallong and Choseo were working on just last week.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, and Steve, maybe you can talk about that decision. I mean, we knew after they were arrested that they were working on a very important piece about the ongoing violence in Rakhine State, but we didn't know the details until this really amazing, groundbreaking, very detailed report was published. Tell us a little bit about the decision that you made in moving ahead with that.
Thank you. Look, you start with the question of what are you in business to do? I mean, fundamentally what we do is we report, we publish, and we distribute news that matters to the world. So this was clearly news that mattered to the world, and it in fact had been stopped by these arrests. So there was kind of a double sort of ethical and moral imperative to publish. You want to, we don't do this for ourselves, and I think it's a sort of an overlay of this entire discussion is we are really proxies for the public. Our job is not to talk among ourselves and to serve ourselves, but to report on things that matter to people out there in the world. And this clearly did. This was a mass execution. We knew that the military was involved in it. We knew that Buddhist villagers were involved in it. We had photographic evidence of what had happened. It's part of a story about the Rohingya Muslims, and we've reported on this for many, many years. Almost 700,000 have had to flee the country. They live in squalid refugee camps in Bangladesh. Writing about this mass execution and having the evidence from the people who participated in it, not just from the side of the victims and their families, was incredibly important. So our bias would always be towards publishing something like that. In addition, our two reporters, Wallon and Choseo, in prison, really wanted us to publish it. It was very important to them to get the story out. So obviously decisions get more difficult if the reporters don't want it out, but they wanted it out. We knew it was important. We knew it's why we're there in the first place. So the decision, while many people said it was a very difficult decision, was actually driven by our basic mission on what we're there to do. So the broader question of do you put people in more or less danger when you go out very publicly, which is something that Kathleen has started to talk about, I agree with her. You never know for sure. We do think in this particular instance, putting as much pressure and as much attention on this subject as possible is probably the best thing to do. And clearly we want to get them out of prison. There are instances in which you might want to be quiet. I remember an instance where we knew somebody who had a personal relationship with the first lady of a country that had our people in prison, and we leveraged that relationship quietly. So we did take a few days in the beginning to try to get the lay of the land, to understand the situation, to understand why are they being held, who is holding them, what the motivations were. But our bias is always going to be go back to the reporting and get the reporting out, and so that's what we did.
So, so you're pulling back from this specific instance, you have a mission to report the news, and you have an obligation to keep your people safe. And extrapolating from your own experience, how does this mounting threat against journalists, the largest number we've ever seen of journalists in prison, high levels of violence, ongoing repression, how do you think that affects the kind of overall environment for news, and how do you make decisions like the ones we just alluded to in that environment?
I think it's pretty clear it's more dangerous now out there in a lot more places than perhaps it's been. It's always been dangerous in war zones. But I think there is a sense in a lot of countries that criticizing journalists, using the concept of fake news or the concept of false news to imprison journalists, I know you have some statistics on that, and to threaten and intimidate journalists, that's just accelerated both in the last year and the last few years. So what you see is it's just tougher when you think about putting journalists into particular situations. You recognize that there's more impunity. There's less pressure to protect journalists. And we see that in many governments, many authoritarian governments who feel as if journalists are fair game. You're seeing the rhetoric, the anti-journalistic rhetoric in a lot of places, and it translates into social media. So we've had instances in some countries where people were threatened very aggressively, including death threats on social media. So you had to deal with that, which is certainly a new threat. You had governments encouraging people to make social media and perhaps other attacks against people. So there's just an acceleration of this hostility that makes it much tougher to navigate.
Reg, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the international response. I mean, in the video we heard, that the Secretary General Guterres spoke out. We've had senior U.S. officials. Rex Tillerson has raised this issue. We've had European officials. We've had other members of Congress speak out. Support from media organizations. What difference has that made? Honestly, how successful has that been in putting pressure on the government of Myanmar, and what evidence do you see of that pressure mounting?
Well, they're still in jail.
Yes, well, that's.
But I mean, look, I think I think it's a necessary condition, perhaps not sufficient. I think it's one of these things where I think when the global community is so united, I think around one view, which is that this is wrong, and that and especially after the story came out, that to sort of say that this is clearly a matter of significance that should have been reported. It's not a state secret. I think it puts the government on notice that this is what the rest of the world thinks, and I think that that's really important. Obviously, as I say, they're still in jail, so they haven't had that sort of impact. But I think that it is important to keep that message going. Obviously, there is there's a legal procedure that's going to go through, but one hopes that somewhere along the way people start sort of trying to make more of the argument that both from a moral perspective and from a legal perspective, frankly, they shouldn't be in jail. If you think about the calculus as you're asking Steve about, the story comes out. One, it shows very clearly that this is an issue of national concern. It's not simply Rohingya Muslims against the rest of the country. We've got Rakhine Buddhists saying, I spoke out because I don't want to see this happen again. And at the same time, I think it also proves that these are reporters doing their jobs. They're not spies or foreign agents or anything like that. And that that's one of the best ways, I think, to demonstrate that the proceedings will show that they're just doing their job. I
mean, also, it lays out the facts so compellingly. In a sense, it puts the facts on the record, and it's so well sourced, and in many cases with named sources, I think it becomes harder to just say it was made up or it didn't happen, and it also just puts on the record what we understand to be the facts. Just to add one thing, because I know it's a challenge CPJ faces and everybody faces. Keeping public interest in a sustained way is incredibly difficult, and it goes back to the conversation that the other panelists had earlier. The news cycles are so fast that if you've got something that really matters and you've got people in jeopardy, but you also have the Olympics and you have the White House crises, and keeping people's eye on individual challenges over a long period of time so that nobody forgets about it and the people on the ground don't forget about it is so amazingly challenging these days, and that's something we've been working hard on.
Yeah, I mean, when I look back at the way, the efforts that CPJ has undertaken in these kinds of cases, and I think about how to evaluate each particular case, I think about it in these terms. There's a clear benefit if you're a repressive government to putting journalists in jail. You stop the flow of information. There might be some negative story you want to suppress. You're able to more effectively control information. On the other side of the scale is the cost that you pay in terms of your international reputation, in terms of your bilateral relationships, in terms of perhaps it has an impact on investments and aid, in military relationships and strategic relationships. So, the challenge is putting as much weight on the scale, that side of the scale as you can, recognizing that some countries will withstand a lot of negative consequences in order to achieve something that they view as beneficial. That being said, we have seen some releases. Ethiopia has released a number of imprisoned journalists this year. Cameroon is another place where we saw a major international campaign, and a prominent journalist who reported on Boko Haram and was imprisoned on anti-state charges as a result has been released. And Kathleen, I just wanted to ask you about the environment. So if the goal is to put as much weight on that side of the scale, on the consequences side of the scale, in the time that you've been doing this, how has the environment changed for doing that? Is it more difficult today, and if so, why?
Well, I think it's more difficult today because of all the things that people have been talking about all afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, despots feel empowered, and they do have the power. Local journalism and journalism worldwide is stressed at the best. But it's also true that it's harder. I mean, what Steve's talking about is exactly right. You're here to publish, and you want to get the journalists freed and their work in front of the audience. But you can't be guaranteed of that even when they're freed. And I'm speaking very generically here, not just in terms of this case. You know, governments actually are successful in cutting off access to microphones.
I think just keep talking and hope for the best. I think that's what it is.
No,
Yes.
I mean, it's a successful tactic to throw journalists in jail, which is why so many of them are in jail. Many feel like they can't continue to work when they get out, or they can't continue to work in that country, so that the sources they've developed and the topics that they know best, they no longer feel safe enough to cover. Their news organization may or may not stand behind them if it's a stressed local organization. And there are just a lot of factors that go into it. Not everybody is lucky enough to have an organization like Reuters or AP or BBC that is behind them and that will do what it takes to get them out. And that's why CPJ is important, because it makes up for all of those organizations that don't have the scratch to try and get their people out of jail. But it's a growing tactic because it works. And that's the thing that we need to worry about. And what I worry about, to be honest, is 262, it sounds awful to us. It's a number to people that we want to care about this. And we have to bring to life the individual journalists we're trying to help, because somebody is going to get excited about them as a human being and maybe do something. But if it's 262, outside of those of us in this room, nobody gives a shit.
Let's talk a little bit about something that Steve alluded to, which is the decision-making process that you go through in terms of deciding whether to go public, whether to work behind the scenes, what kinds of strategies are best deployed in what circumstance, what kinds of factors go into that decision.
Is that for Kathleen?
That's for Kathleen, and then I'll follow up.
Well, it's like taking a puzzle apart. You know, you say, okay, who has them? What you're trying to find the place where the person made a decision that this should happen, and then try and understand if you have any way to influence that decision and get your people out. And that's a different calculation. Will the court system likely yield a good result here? Do we need to hire lawyers who know somebody who knows somebody? Do we, create a great public stink? Who do we know who can have influence over whatever entity is holding them? And that's true whether it's a government or if you've got somebody who's kidnapped by a rogue outlet and you hope they haven't sold your fellow or your gal upstream somewhere. So it's just unpacking a puzzle. Like, you have to use your reporting techniques, and you have to hope that you can find somebody who can help you figure it out. Do you know somebody who knows somebody who can make a call and make a case for your person? And it sometimes takes a very long time to do that. And sometimes when you get to the end of that trail, you discover that it's an incredibly stupid piece of information from somebody really low in a food chain, but it's on the freight train now, and nobody wants to stop it, and that's incredibly frustrating.
No, I agree, and that was one of the reasons I was in. I went to Yangon in December, which was to just start asking around, right? Why do we think they were taken? Where was that decision made by who? At what point did it become, sort of a bigger issue that would say on a freight train you can't undo, and then you start looking at where all the points of contact might be, where there might be some areas of influence, and you start trying to map that out. And I think you try to do that before you start going too public, before you start making too much of an issue, because you want to know what levers you can pull. With the government, it's actually, in some cases, it is relatively straightforward. Sometimes there is a map, there are consultants, there are people you can talk to. When someone gets kidnapped, it becomes much more difficult, and it really depends then on what your contacts are like with that whole milieu of people, and who you think has them, and what they want from you.
And having made the determination that the best route is to keep the story alive, keep their case front and center, what kinds of strategies have you employed, and what kinds of responses? Kathleen talked a lot about support and solidarity from news organizations. They also have to report the news, and that's a consideration. That they have to look at everything through the framework of their obligation to inform the public. What kinds of responses have you gotten, and what strategies have you employed to try and keep attention on this situation?
Well, we called you up.
Yes, and you're always free to do that. Yeah, but
well, a few things I'd say, and I'm sure Reg can supplement it. The diplomatic community, including Canada, by the way, where the foreign minister and her team have been very helpful, has really stepped up. So I can't even name them all, but the EU and the UN and Australia and Canada and Japan and the US and the UN, and there's been a tremendous outpouring of diplomatic support. And how that translates is both quiet conversations where the ambassador goes in and talks to officials there, but also they're all showing up at the court hearings, which is extremely helpful and gratifying. And the entire press corps is showing up. So you see the pictures of them being transferred from the jail to the courtroom, and it's a huge, cameras everywhere, microphones everywhere. So it's just putting a lot of attention on it. Some of the diplomatic interventions are kind of back channel and private. Some people are being more open about, but there's a constant flow of that. And I think that's probably helpful. Of course, nothing has worked yet, but that's probably helpful. And just to mention one other thing and turn it back to Reg, Kathleen and I have worked together quite a lot, and she's also worked with my predecessor. When I first got this job, we had an immediate problem, both in Ivory Coast and in Libya. And so there's a network of editors who have dealt with these situations. So you talk to each other, what are you hearing on the ground? What are you learning? What do you plan to do? And frankly, you have to put the competitive stuff aside and just work together to figure out how to get your people safe. And the kind of the global community of editors has typically been very, very good about that.
So it sounds like you have a somewhat different view of that, because Kathleen, you were quite critical.
Right.
You really thought that the media community had not stepped up the way it should, but
I think
Steve's
that's right.
experience has been more positive.
No, Steve is exactly right. Whenever we've, as fierce competitors, we've still worked together very closely on the safety issues. I meant more trying to get other people who are, the international agencies really bond together quite well. And, but, if you tried to organize whether you were going to have peanut butter and jelly with strawberry or grape at the White House press corps, you would spend 6 days and never resolve it. And there would be a lot of harumphing and huffing. And so and it's true here in Canada as well. I've encountered it as well, where you're trying to get something done for the greater good of either an individual journalist or for a principled stand that we all should take. And people just cannot be corralled. It would be hard to imagine a lot of places in North America where there was a journalist in trouble and everybody else would show up at the court hearing as they're doing in Myanmar. And it happens in communities in Mexico and other places, but aside from, and I'm glad that you're getting the support that you should have in this effort. But I think in general, our threats go unanswered because we cannot get ourselves out of our own way.
But your critique is, I think, specifically North American, right?
It is very North.
You're saying more that journalists.
Well, Western Europe, I'd throw that in there too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Although I will say that you do see in certain within the press communities in certain European countries, France, Spain come to mind. You do see much more of a kind of activist response in my experience, a greater ability to put those kinds of competitive pressures aside. Of course, it is case by case. But I wanted to go back to the title of the overall discussion today is journalism under Trumpism. So I want to go back to Trumpism. In this particular case, the case of the Reuters journalist, the U.S. response has been quite open and supportive. You have the Secretary of State who's been very outspoken. You have support from the embassy in Myanmar. They've been attending. I think they've been sending.
The ambassador has been fantastic. He's been really good.
At the same time, you have the government of Myanmar, along with many other countries, adopting this rhetoric of fake news to undermine reporting on the Rohingya crisis. And you have, as Courtney mentioned in her presentation, a sharp increase in the number of governments that are using these charges of fake news to justify imprisoning journalists. And so we've seen a sharp increase in both the number of countries employing that kind of rhetoric and the number of journalists in prison under those kinds of charges. So what is the overall environment in terms of enlisting the United States, both in this particular case and more broadly, when news organizations are facing challenges? It might be easier for you to talk about that, Kathleen, but I'd love to hear from Reg or Steve.
Original front lines right now.
Again, I think in many cases, I think it really does come down to the ambassador. And at this point, obviously, we're very grateful to Rex Tillerson for coming out and Scott Marcial, the ambassador in Yangon, has been fantastic. So to some extent, I think it is really sort of who the individuals are. Clearly there's a bigger issue at play, which is no matter what the ambassador says or what the Secretary of State says, there's also that whole U.S. whatever country relation, and if the administration doesn't want to put any additional pressure, it doesn't really make much difference beyond a certain point. So it's good when the right words are said, but I think a lot of other things, a lot of other factors come into play. So if you look at the Philippines and Duterte, and clearly there's a sort of a very different kind of relationship there between Trump and the president, and so I don't think you'll see that sort of pressure get exerted there should anybody get in trouble. And obviously, Rappler, the news organization, is in trouble there now. Right. So I think it really depends on which country we're looking at and what the relationships are and how strong the ambassador is. I don't think there's a blanket statement to be made other than obviously it's not as good as it used to be in terms of the sort of moral pressure you could expect the U.S. to exert.
But the calculation that you're just highlighting here, which is the U.S. response would likely be more based in what's in the U.S. Strategic interests rather than a free press issue. That's a calculation that predates Trump.
To some extent, yes, but it also, I think, because Trump is president, I think it also has to do with what his personal feelings about anything are at any given moment.
There's certainly more hot sauce on it.
Yes.
I would go back to what Kathleen just said. We've been seeing this for quite a while, and it's not an original idea, but Trumpism may be more effect than cause. But there has been a decline in respect for free press, for freedom of speech, for journalism around the world, and I've been very frustrated, as you know, Joel, and many other people have been, by international institutions not taking it as seriously, because I think of the desire to, frankly, do business in countries that are highly repressive. You haven't seen global organizations that might traditionally have been very supportive of free press. That is now combined with what people are hearing from the U.S. The combination of that, the journalist as the enemy of the people, plus journalists perhaps as the enemy of looking the other way so you can do good business in repressive countries. Combination of those two things is very pernicious and has had a big effect.
And I just want to throw in one other. This is all happening at a time when I think the threats and the ability to respond to them is getting increasingly difficult, right? So clearly, as we all of us here think a lot about sort of, not just the pre-publication, but really how do we keep people safe when they're out reporting? And there was a time when you would focus on flak jackets and helmets and war zones and where you would go, and that was already dangerous and difficult enough. Then, of course, it became, kidnapping and not governments taking people with far less pressure. And now we've moved into an age of much more concern about digital security and information security and how to protect all of those things when just on your day-to-day reporting. And then, of course, now we have social media and harassment and so on. So the threats have proliferated, and the responses are not as good. I'm trying to be a little more upbeat, but I'm not succeeding here.
Well, we're going to go to questions in a moment, so if you have questions, start thinking about them. But let me just ask you this, one other thing, the role of technology. So that was something that was touched on the earlier panel. So technology has fragmented the media landscape. It's a much more complex landscape. It's obviously had implications in terms of the economic model. And it's made some of this kind of challenging around messaging more complicated. So how do you conduct this kind of, apply this consistent pressure? We can call it a campaign. Maybe that's not a comfortable word for a media organization, but you want to keep the pressure on. How do you do that, incorporating social media, new kinds of technologies, and how effective is that?
It's a very difficult one. I mean, in this specific case, we understand in Myanmar, basically, Facebook is the internet. And so, we've put up a Facebook page.
In Burmese.
In Burmese, because, again, the English literacy is not great. And so those are the sorts of things that we're doing now. When we published that report on the mass grave in Indin, we made sure we had a Burmese translation ready. And that way also, if any news organizations wanted to run it locally, they didn't have to use our translation, but at least we provided them one so that it would be a clean translation of what we planned to say rather than somebody else's idea of what we had said. So those, again, in any individual case, we have to sort of figure out what the way news propagates in that country, and then take hold of it as much as we can.
I'd like to add just a tiny bit of optimism, since we're
good.
short.
Thank you.
But I think technology has also helped in the storytelling, and let's just keep the focus on this particular story. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have had the stunning photography if there weren't smartphones among the villagers.
Yeah.
And people can't not believe those pictures, and you were able to use the pictures and make each of the victims come alive as well, and that adds to the power of the story. And so for the story to have legs and be believable, I think technology has helped, and that's true for journalism writ large, but I think this is a really good example of something that you wouldn't have had even 10 or 15 years ago.
It's true.
Okay, let's go to questions. There's lots of hands. I think I'm going to start with Jeff, and then we'll go to Paul in the back there.
I want to focus on a point, Kathleen, that you raised, and I think it's because it's well known, at least in the case of Jason Resign. We at National Press Club, we led that campaign along with the Washington Post, and had great cooperation with Secretary Kerry and a bunch of other entities. I mean, quietly, Reuters helped. A lot of people helped. The small fry, because it's in the CPJ report and also CJR, that more and more people that are being jailed are freelancers.
Yeah.
Or individuals, small fries, people that do not have, as you call it, the scratch to get behind and campaign, like Jason's brother Ali and other people, et cetera. How do we make sure we have a formula that goes beyond, that gets to your criticism of the effort that it seems to be? We care when it's our guy, but what happens when it's the competition? I mean, there was coalition help, at least in our case, and I'm sure a lot of us, I know we've reached out to Reuters, and you've reached out to Reuters, but what about the guy or gal that doesn't have a giant organization behind them.
And before you answer, let me just give others who are just a little bit of context. So Jason Rezaian was the correspondent for the Washington Post, and he was imprisoned in Iran, and there was a big push globally by the Post and with support from Secretary Kerry to win his release. So go ahead.
The thing that I think gets lost in this discussion about freelancers is the responsibility of the news organizations who hire the freelancers. And I think too many of them have absolutely abdicated their morality in this. There are too many journalists, now, not as many as was true even 10 years ago, but there were a lot of news organizations that had ambitions beyond their capabilities. And so they would take stuff from freelancers. They didn't have any idea, they didn't know enough to know whether the freelancer was taking chances. The freelancer knew that they were maybe going to get paid if they delivered something great. The organizations, when I was at AP and Reuters, a lot of us have created and signed and encouraged others to sign a set of guidelines by which you wouldn't use freelancers. You wouldn't have them go on spec. You want to make sure they had insurance. You want to make sure that they knew where they were going. And you didn't have some person on the desk at night who was interested in some story without really understanding what the consequences were going to be. And the person who pays the price is the freelancer. If we don't do anything during our time in these jobs, it's got to be that we figure out how to make news organizations understand the costs that they are extracting from freelancers in the field.
And I think, very, very clearly now, your organization, your past organization, and Reuters and others have sort of taken on much more responsibility for freelancers now in terms of training and so on. And the manifesto, the guidelines that you talked about, those were created by ACOS, which is this wonderful new organization that's been found, a culture of safety, which really speaks to trying to get sort of a set of guidelines around how freelancers should be treated from a security and safety point of view, but even to the point of thinking through, trying to do editor training so that editors at organizations that might commission freelancers would have a checklist of things to ask about from a safety point of view. Because in many cases, it's not necessarily their fault. They've never sent someone to Turkey. They need to think. They need some help in thinking through what are the issues.
Yeah, and I think this is a problem from CPJ's perspective. Obviously, once something bad happens, regardless, we're not looking to point fingers. We're looking to do everything we can to do the kinds of things that a larger news organization might do in terms of rallying support, building pressure, thinking strategically about what tactics we can employ, and of course, the other side of this discussion as well is we want to see freelancers embrace this culture of safety, and we want to see their editors do so as well. But this is always going to be a profession that is unregulated. Nobody needs a license to be a journalist, thankfully, and there will be some people who will go off and do some things they shouldn't do and get into trouble. So while we're trying to make it trying to raise awareness and make it as safe as we can, there also has to be a recognition that there will be circumstances where people do things that maybe they shouldn't have done, and we still have to come through and respond and support them. I think, Paul, you were next, then we'll go to you over there.
So my question is, I don't think I heard China among the list of people, of ambassadors who were showing up at the trial and giving all this kind of support. And of course, as we drift away from thinking of the U.S. as the world's only superpower, our thoughts turn to China. And I'm wondering, which doesn't have a great track record internally, which has a great track record of economic expansion, aid programs, and so on in Latin America and Africa, and so on, where some of these press freedom issues are also important. Have you any thoughts to share on the importance of this, of that power shift, particularly as it regards to Burma, whose economic relationship with China, I understand, is not negligible.
So when I was there, I had a bunch of conversations about who had influence in the country. China was one of them, among some others. And yes, regrettably, China has not shown up or said anything.
Understanding the sensitivity of talking about it in this particular instance, let me pull back and say that China is the second leading jailer of journalists. We've seen a closing, more repressive, more restricted environment in China. We've also seen, while China it's unusual that China would actually imprison an employee of an international news organization. They have other ways of applying lots of pressure, making things very uncomfortable. We saw a period in time when there were many restrictions on visas. That seems to have calmed a little bit, but that's something that's hanging out there that everyone's aware of. And of course, China, in terms of building these kinds of relationships, their basic pitch is we care only about the economic relationship. It's transactional. Unlike these pesky Americans or Europeans, we're not going to come after you on human rights. We're not going to pressure you on press freedom. There's also all sorts of new technology being developed by China that's being embraced by some of these repressive governments and used to carry out, to control the online space. And finally, China has a very negative record in terms of its role within international organizations, particularly the UN. So China, as in terms of its own domestic space and in terms of its global influence, is a big challenge, unquestionably. So the question in the vest, and then the woman in the purple, you're next.
This is more for Kathleen, but please, Stephen and Reg, if you have a sort of a journalistic opinion from a different perspective, I'd love to hear your answer. In the last year, perhaps because of the election of President Trump, we've seen more involvement from Hollywood in terms of attention to journalistic causes. How do you manage that relationship? And how do you sort of harness the new attention that's been brought to the plights of journalists around the world? Does it help, or does it sort of distract from the things that you are doing?
I think it would distract if the attention was being used for something other than the cause that we're here to talk about, and that's not been our experience so far. There have been other circumstances where you realize, that somebody is there to promote their movie, but that's not been the case here. The support that we've had, it's been important and genuine and effective and really right on point. So I know the problem you're describing, but that has not been our experience, happily.
Anyone else want to? No? Okay. We have.
Hi, Reg, I know you used to work for South China Morning Post, and so I thought...
That was a glorious 20 months.
Oh, that was it? Okay. So my question is, does it make a difference whether you're working for South China Morning Post versus Wall Street Journal versus Reuters in terms of, say, China trying to control what you disseminate as news or threats? I know you only worked there for 20 months, but do you know if there's a difference as to what organization you work for?
Well, I'm guessing if you work for Xinhua, you have slightly different rules. I mean, look, at the Journal and at the SCMP and at Reuters, there really wasn't a huge amount of difference, at least during my time. Never had anybody say you can't publish that, never had anybody say you shouldn't think about that. I mean, obviously you have different audiences, and you speak to your audiences, and you speak to what you think they're interested in. But you do work on, you work on honesty, on impartiality, on fairness, and so on. So no, actually, I did not have a problem in my time there. There were instances where I wondered if I would, but at the end of the day, it always worked out fine. So that was it. I guess I was lucky, or I was good, or whatever, but it worked out well.
Okay.
Have either of you experienced anything in terms of,
I don't think so, no, no.
Not among Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and Reuters. It's been roughly the same.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. There's one there. Wait for the microphone because we're live streaming.
Thank you. Just on the case of the Myanmar journalists, your colleagues, what steps did you put in place to protect them, knowing that they were working on this very sensitive piece? And secondly, is there, kind of just out of interest, is there something about giving the Myanmar regime a way out? Like, how does that factor into the negotiations? The whole concept of saving face.
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
no, please. He's head of security.
Well, no. So I don't want to talk in detail about security measures and so on. We have a whole set of protocols in place, and you have to say that that there are times when if somebody says come and have dinner, want to talk to you. You think about it and you say, well, where should I meet you? Do I want to meet you on a military base or a police camp, or do I want to meet you at a restaurant? So, I mean, to the extent that they did the things that they should have done, I think we're sort of well covered. I mean, obviously, over the course, this story was reported over the course of months. So, at some point, clearly, people had picked up some wind of it. So no, I mean we're satisfied that we did what we could do. I think if you go to dinner with a policeman and he hands you a document, tells you not to read it until you step outside, and a bunch of people jump on you. There's a limit to what you can do under those circumstances. And then in terms, I think more broadly of saving face and so on. I mean, I think it really is a question for us of just sort of laying out the facts and being as clear as possible, trying to win the case on its merits while also making the case in the broader public about what they were doing, and that sort of just pointing out the issues of press freedom and the issues of the importance of the Myanmar public understanding what's going on, so that there's a greater public interest that the government can turn to and say this is really why they should be let free.
I want to end by asking another question of Steve, and this is the last question. You sort of alluded, and this hopefully is a chance to end on a mildly optimistic note, because there's no denying that this is a difficult and distressing topic. But you had talked about strategies for engaging the broader international community, particularly the business community, around these issues, because we can't just fight these battles. We can't just fight this one battle at a time. We have to have a sort of broader strategy. And I wonder if you could tell us, I know this is something you pursued for some time, tell us a little bit about the kinds of reactions you've gotten and if you think there is a way forward.
So you were saying this is to end on an optimistic note.
I'm hoping.
It wasn't the best question to answer on an optimistic note. So far, there is not a very positive reaction by the global international community, multinational corporations, multinational institutions, kind of the big global institutions that you try to rely on. I have to say the UN, particularly with Secretary General Guterres, has stepped up in this particular instance, and I think has shown more interest in these issues. But there's one thing to make statements, and again, it's another thing to exercise influence. And broadly, I would say, in part because there's this wariness of upsetting big, powerful countries that operate in an authoritarian way. That's been very difficult. So if I look at what I say is optimistic, I'd say that certainly in our instance right now, journalistic support has actually been very strong. I think generally globally public support and public interest has been strong, diplomatic involvement in this particular case, because I think everything has come together in this particular case. People understand this is a matter of huge importance. It's something people have reported on for quite a while. It's dramatically heartbreaking to look at what's going on with the Rohingya, and I think people get that, and they appreciate the reporting that's going on. Therefore, they recognize the need to protect journalists who are doing it. I mean, another thing I would say, perhaps maybe on a more optimistic note generally. Doing dangerous and risky reporting is actually risky and dangerous. And and we do everything we can to keep people safe in the context of doing the work. So we do hostile environment training. We give them all the equipment they can use. We give them cybersecurity training. We supervise them closely to make sure they don't do things that are unnecessarily risky. But what I'd say optimistically is there are hundreds and thousands of journalists out there who actually want to do this work and are doing it very creatively and effectively and are getting a lot of news out there that a lot of authoritarian governments don't want them to have. And despite everything we can say about all the pressures, they're still doing the work, and they're doing it really well. And I'm perpetually proud to have a small part in this profession, because it's still a very noble profession, and it's doing really important work.
Wow, that was
Wow.
That was very
All right. Well, I think you speak for all of us, and I think what you've done is just made clear, why this matters. I mean, something that Kathleen talked about, why this really matters, and why we all have such a stake in defending the journalists. Everyone talks about how technology has transformed this profession, and unquestionably it has. But at the end of the line, there are some brave journalists who have to go out and do the reporting, and we have an obligation as news consumers, as people who care about the world, to stand up for them and support efforts to win their freedom. So that certainly is something we can all embrace.